subject. I'm excited to tell you all about it. Okay, so around the world, over 70% of fisheries are being overfished. And since the middle of the 20th century, the demand for seafood has increased dramatically, both because of rising populations and increased incomes. This huge demand has placed pressure on wild fish stocks and has created a global question as to the sustainability of the seas. Scientists predict with certainty that by 2050, the world's seafood stocks will have collapsed entirely if we continue fishing at current rates. Our consumption has a distorting effect on the ocean. We like to eat top predatory fish like cod, swordfish, or tuna, and because of this preference, 90% of the biomass of predatory fish has been lost from the oceans. Because of this, we're essentially pulling on the strings of the marine food web. So fish lower on the predatory hierarchy are replacing top species. The average size of ocean fish is declining. The long-run effects of these changes are unknown, primarily because we don't really know that much about the ocean. We've explored outer space more than we've explored the deep seas. And over the past decade, we've discovered over 1,000 new marine species that we never knew about before. Commercial fishing uses capital-intensive methods to catch as many fish as possible. Trawlers like this one are perhaps the most common and most destructive method. Trawlers drag huge nets behind them and catch everything in their path. Bycatch, or non-targeted species like dolphins, turtles, seabirds, and fish that aren't commercially marketable, can account for 75% of the total catch. Trawlers also destroy the seabed habitat. What was once a diverse and varying landscape becomes a homogeneous flatland as the net drags across it. It's easy to compare trawling to the deforestation of the world's rainforests, but because it's underwater, it's harder to see. Some trawlers can destroy up to 530 million square miles per day. So what struck me while doing this research is the fact that we've seen this problem before, over and over again. The American bison was once the most prevalent large mammal on the continent. Commercial demands for hides that were used as machine belts in New England factories and European factories drove buffalo populations to near extinction. In response, the United States government in the early 1900s passed a series of laws that outlawed the hunting of wild game for commercial purposes. But these laws excluded oceanic fish from conservation because at the time it seemed a fool's errand. Why conserve what is limitless? So here we see two men standing on top of a pile of bison skulls in the Great Plains, which is strikingly similar to this image of the catch of jack mackerel off the coast of Chile. The problem is that we value this kind of animal over this kind of animal. This is the Atlantic menhaden, and unfortunately for him, he's pretty smelly, and he's not as charismatic as the tiger or the polar bear. This little guy is about the size of your palm, and he supports the entire Gulf of Mexico ecosystem. When he swims, the menhaden filters water through his gills at about 3 gallons per minute, which is absolutely necessary in deltas where agricultural runoff causes eutrophication and algae blooms. And because he eats plants, he provides a critical link between primary producers and tertiary consumers in the food web. The menhaden fishery has become the largest fishery in the United States, and you'll never eat one. They're used primarily for industrial purposes and for those omega-3 fish oil pills your doctor recommended you. But the commercial demand for the menhaden is threatening not only the individual species, but the entire ecosystem. So this is an economics thesis, so let's talk a little bit about economics. The bigger theoretical problem at hand here is how to manage common pool resources. Common pool resources are open access, but limited. So the more people who participate in the consumption of the commons, the less there is for everyone. This graph shows the problem that fisheries face from an industry level. So on the x-axis, we have effort, or the number of boats involved in the fishery. And on the y-axis, you have the total catch, which is also equal to the total revenue, which is this bell graph, and the total cost, which is the straight line up. So competitive fleets will continue to join the market until the point where profit has been maximized across the fleet, which is point B here. However, you'll see that the same yield would be caught with less effort and less cost at point A. The most efficient allocation of resources would be if there were less producers catching more fish per boat. And this point is called the maximum economic yield. And often, it's actually less than the scientifically estimated most sustainable yield at the top of the curve. The problem is how to move production from point B to point A. And this problem is referred to as the effort creep. As long as profits are still being made in the industry, more fishing boats will enter the market, creeping toward point B. This overcapitalization of the fishing industry is a huge problem, accounting for up to $2 trillion in waste over the past 3 decades, according to the World Bank. Reducing fleets to an economically efficient point would also reduce pressure on marine stocks. And here's also where free trade comes in. As trade has been liberalized over the past 50 years, many developing countries' structural adjustment programs encourage the capitalization of fisheries and the export of those products to create economic growth. Countries increased the number of boats, bought new gear and nets for those boats, and fished harder, and in return they did see huge profits in the short run. But as foreign and domestic direct investment in fisheries crept towards overcapitalization, fisheries in Chile, Peru, and Namibia, among others, saw the overall decline in fish catch, followed by an ecological collapse of the fisheries. So this isn't a long-run solution to economic growth. So step back. How do we deal with this? The United Nations and the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, along with the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tuna, or ICAT, are just a few of the organizations who have tried to regulate fishing to a sustainable level. The problem is that these organizations lack an enforcement mechanism, and so are not as effective in their command and control efforts. For example, ICAT policymakers, who are supposed to manage tuna stocks at a sustainable level, set a quota for bluefin tuna that was a level twice what ICAT scientists had recommended. And even then, in 2007, every member country violated their assigned target. Now, I can't stand here and tell you that after 1 year of reading a lot about fish that I have a solution to this problem. I don't. And this is a thing that people have been working on for centuries. These issues are terribly complex. But I do think that market mechanisms have to be involved if we're to get anywhere in terms of conservation. Too often environmental agreements get ignored because they depend on the goodwill and cooperation of the international community. But in the late 1980s, when the issue of ozone depletion became an international concern, the world responded with a different kind of agreement. The Montreal Protocol used trade mechanisms enforced through the GATT, which is the pre-1994 World Trade Organization, to ban the import or export of harmful chemicals to non-member countries of the treaty. Because of the market integration into the environmental treaty and the strong enforcement that the GATT provided, it's safe to say that today ozone depletion has become a minor concern in the environmental movement. So what if we could do something similar with fisheries? A new binding treaty that took into account ecosystem-based management principles and scientific recommendations, but was also integrated into the WTO framework would, I think, be a much more successful model for sustainability. Regulation banning the export or import of fish products from non-member countries would deal with the issue of pollution havens, which allow industries to operate in countries without strong environmental regulations. So this presentation, I hope, has introduced some new ideas to you about fisheries and ocean sustainability. There's so much more about this topic, and I encourage everyone to learn more. And to do that, I've actually brought these seafood watch wallet cards from the Monterey Bay Aquarium that I'm going to pass out now, and you should all take one, and it'll help you in your seafood choice decisions to make the most sustainable choice. In the end, fishery conservation is an economic, environmental, and social challenge, but one that we must rise to. I want to thank you for listening, and thank my advisor, Professor Edelman, for listening to me talk about fish all year long, and would welcome any questions at this time. Thank you.
Well, I know there are subsidy issues in U.S. agriculture, and I'm wondering, looking at that curve, if there are also subsidy issues in the fisheries, because you could actually keep on moving up that total cost if the subsidies were included and therefore keep on reducing.
Yeah, definitely. Fishery subsidies are a huge problem, and it's something that I haven't really touched on in this thesis. But that's actually the main direction that the World Trade Organization is going in, and the past, 10 years of negotiations for the new treaty of the WTO, the Uruguay round, has been dealing with fishery subsidies. And they haven't really gotten anywhere because that's always a really hard battle. But yes, the subsidy issue is a huge problem.
What form do the subsidies come in generally?
A lot of them come in the form of technical assistance, so you can buy new, better, stronger boats, bigger engines, bigger nets, things like that.
What's the prognosis for small-scale fishermen who aren't going to buy the bigger boats?
Yeah, and that's the question, I think, is that in places where the fisheries have been completely depleted by bigger boats, subsistence fishermen have seen a total collapse of their catch, and that leads to a lot of social unrest when people don't have access to their food resources. For example, the piracy in Somalia, a lot of the root causes of that, about 20 years ago, certainly not today, but the root causes were foreign fishing vessels going into Somali waters that were unprotected, and the fishermen there retaliating against those large trawlers from European countries by pirating. And it's taken a different form in the last 20 years, but that's how it kind of started.
Other questions? Okay, excellent, right on time.